deep dive.
Yeah.
It's called Det tavse skrig fra katakren, and that translates to The Silent Scream from the Meat Grinder. It's by a Danish author, Tu Glirup Torstved.
Yeah, I've got to say, just the structure of the book itself is really fascinating. It's a mix of autobiography and philosophical reflections and deep dives into programming and even some fictional narratives. It's all kind of interwoven together.
It's a lot, yeah. It is. It really is like a digital tapestry. And at the heart of it all is Tu himself. He had a pretty tough childhood. Growing up, he felt like an outsider in his working class neighborhood in Aarhus. But there were two things that were kind of his escapes: computers and books. And what I find really fascinating about both of those is that they both offer a kind of world that you can step into. You can kind of control that world in a way. Yeah.
Yeah. And that need for control.
Yeah.
For connection in a world that felt really isolating. That's a thread that runs through the whole book.
Yeah.
And it's even more poignant, I think, when, that he was diagnosed with schizophrenia at 25.
Yeah.
The Silent Scream was actually written during his first hospitalization.
Wow.
Yeah.
So let's get into the book.
Okay.
It starts with his early fascination with computers, particularly the Commodore Amiga 500. It wasn't just a gadget for him. It was really a refuge from a lot of the social challenges that he was facing.
Yeah, I think it's really important to remember, what the Amiga represented back then. It was this creative powerhouse. Unlike a lot of the computers at the time, it had these really advanced graphics and sound capabilities. It allows you to create music art, even these simple animations. And for someone who is feeling like a total outcast, this machine offered a way for him to build his own worlds, to express himself in ways that maybe he didn't feel comfortable doing in real life.
Yeah. So instead of just consuming, he was creating. And I imagine that gave him a sense of agency that maybe he didn't have elsewhere.
Yeah, exactly. He even goes into this concept of duplication, which computers kind of exemplify.
Yeah.
It's almost like he was captivated by the fact that computers could create these perfect copies and that they could interact with other intelligences within their own systems. It's almost like he saw a mirror to his own desire for connection and understanding in the way these machines worked.
That's a really thought-provoking connection.
Yeah.
It makes me think about how, for people who are struggling with social interactions or maybe even mental health challenges, technology can offer this safe space to connect with others and to express themselves. Think about online communities, think about virtual worlds. All those things allow people to kind of interact on their own terms.
Exactly, yeah. And this idea of technology as a tool for expression, this becomes even more pronounced when we get to his vision for what he calls the ultimate computer.
Yes. This public abstract virtual computer, as he calls it, is where the book takes a turn. It's almost like it goes from personal reflection to this kind of like tech manifesto.
Right. And it's not just this tech fantasy. He lays out these really detailed specifications. Like he talks about dual processing, which is essentially having two central processing units that are working together at the same time. And that allows for much faster and more complex computations.
Okay, so that's the power aspect. But what about the abstract and the virtual? I've got to admit, I found those parts a bit harder to kind of wrap my head around.
Well, he's basically saying that, the future of computing is in moving beyond the physical limitations of hardware.
Okay.
He envisions a system where software is really the defining element, where the virtual environment is more important than the physical machine itself. And this idea ties into his idea of abstraction, creating these systems that can handle these incredibly complex tasks without the users needing to understand the underlying details.
Okay.
Think about how we use smartphones today. We don't need to know anything about coding to send a text or take a picture.
So he was basically predicting the rise of cloud computing, apps, and this whole idea of software as a service way back then.
Yeah, pretty much. And, what makes his anxieties about human resistance to change even more fascinating.
Yeah.
He argues that our fear of the new is actually what's holding us back from realizing the true potential of technology.
Wow.
And he doesn't just throw that out there. He brings up examples from gaming, music, cryptography, even art. He saw how people just clung to the old ways of doing things, even when new technologies offered these really clear advantages.
So it's almost like he could see the debates that we're having today about AI, about genetic engineering, even the metaverse. It's that same kind of fear of the unknown, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And for Torstved, it wasn't just this social phenomenon. You know, he saw it as like a deeply ingrained human flaw.
So here we have this young man who is finding refuge in technology. He's battling his own inner demons, and at the same time, he's envisioning a future where technology could reshape humanity.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot to unpack, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
Mhm.
And we're just scratching the surface here. You know what makes the silent scream so powerful? It forces us to confront these really big questions, not just about technology, but about ourselves.
Yeah. It's like he's holding up a mirror, and it's reflecting both the brilliance and the anxieties of what it means to be human in this digital age that we're all in.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's precisely what makes this deep dive so compelling, I think. We're not just exploring a book, we're really exploring what it means to be human in a world that is increasingly shaped by technology.
Well said. There's so much more to uncover, though. Join us for part 2, where we'll delve even deeper into the author's personal journey and his struggle to find connection and meaning in a world that's both enabled and complicated by technology. Welcome back to our deep dive into the silent scream from the meat grinder. In this part, I want to explore further, how Torstvid kind of weaves his experiences with schizophrenia into his views on technology.
Yeah, it's something that really struck me. It wasn't just a side note or anything. It felt like it was really integral to the way that he saw the world, both the real world and, the digital one that he was creating in his mind.
Exactly. And there's this one passage in particular where he talks about, his memories feeling like scattered files on a hard drive,
Oh, wow.
fragmented and inaccessible. And it's just this really powerful image that I think anyone who's ever struggled with memory issues can relate to, whether it's due
Yeah.
to an illness or just the chaos of life.
Yeah, I mean, it really got to me because it made me think about how our brains, like computers, rely on this really intricate organization of information. And when that organization breaks down, it can be so disorienting.
Absolutely. He's using this very precise technical language to describe something that's so personal and often really difficult to articulate.
Yeah.
And in doing so, he's inviting us to see mental illness not as some abstract concept,
Yeah.
but as a lived experience that in some ways mirrors the complexities of technology itself.
Yeah. And it also makes his fascination with that whole concept of duplication even more interesting.
Right.
I mean, he's drawn to this idea that computers can create these perfect copies,
Uh-huh.
this kind of order and predictability that's often lacking in human experience, especially when you're dealing with a condition like schizophrenia.
Precisely. But it's not just about seeking order.
Hmm.
It's about control, too.
Right.
In the digital world, he could create, manipulate, and even delete information with a precision that you just can't get in the real world.
Which kind of brings us to his history with hacking. It's almost like an extension of that desire for control, isn't it? This ability to circumvent rules, to access this kind of forbidden knowledge, to kind of bend systems to his will.
It is, and it's important to point out,
Mm.
that his perspective on hacking actually kind of evolves throughout the book.
Right.
Yeah. Like as a teenager, it's portrayed as this form of playful exploration, almost like a puzzle to be solved. But then as he gets older and the consequences become more real, he really starts to grapple with the ethical implications.
Okay, so there's this real sense of conflict there. On the one hand, he's obviously really proud of his skills, the intellectual challenge of it all. But on the other hand, there's regret. There's this recognition that, his actions had real consequences, that he crossed lines that he shouldn't have crossed.
And that's where I think the Silent Scream goes beyond a simple memoir. You know what I mean? He's not just recounting his life. He's using his experiences to raise all these questions about the nature of technology itself. Like, when does curiosity become criminal? What are the limits of exploration in the digital age? I mean, these are questions that are even more relevant today, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we're constantly debating, the ethics of data privacy, surveillance, cyber warfare. It's like
Yeah.
his personal struggles are mirroring all these larger societal debates.
They are, yeah. And this brings us to a really crucial point in the book, where he introduces this concept of IV at NOV, his personal AI project.
Yes. This is like a culmination of all his fascinations, isn't it?
Yeah.
Programming,
Yeah.
philosophy, this desire to understand consciousness. It's like he's not just building a piece of software. He's trying to create something that thinks, that learns, and that in some ways kind of reflects back on him, on its creator.
Yeah. And it's important to remember, he wrote this long before the current AI boom.
Right.
So his ideas about artificial intelligence are incredibly prescient. He was grappling with the same questions that we're facing today. Like, what are the ethical considerations? What happens when we create machines that can actually think for themselves?
It is kind of mind-blowing to think that he was already exploring these issues decades ago. And what I find so interesting is that he sees AI as more than just a technological advancement. It's almost like a philosophical quest for him.
Yeah.
It's like this way to understand the nature of consciousness itself.
And this is where I think his struggles with mental illness become even more relevant.
Okay.
He's constantly questioning his own perception of reality,
But
the lines between his inner world and the external world. And in AI, he sees this potential tool for kind of bridging that gap,
yeah.
for connecting with something outside of himself.
It's like he's imagining a world where technology could actually help people like him,
Ah,
help them overcome the isolation and the disconnect that can often come with mental illness.
exactly. And it's not just about AI.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, his whole vision for Reawood, this immersive 3D interface for the internet, is about breaking down barriers.
Yeah.
He's imagining a world where physical limitations don't define our experiences anymore. Where we can connect with information with each other in ways that we can't even really imagine right now.
It's a vision that's so exciting and at the same time a little bit scary.
Yeah.
The idea that we could kind of lose ourselves in these digital worlds, that the line between reality and simulation could become increasingly blurred.
And that's the challenge that he's posing to us. As we kind of delve deeper into these technological frontiers, we need to be aware of the potential consequences for ourselves as individuals and for society as a whole.
It's a lot to consider, but what strikes me is that even with all of these anxieties, he never loses sight of the potential for good.
Absolutely. He's not a techno-pessimist or anything. He sees technology as this tool, this powerful force that can be used for creation or for destruction. And ultimately, he believes it's up to us, as humans, to decide which path we take.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the silent scream from the meat grinder. We've been exploring all these really complex ideas about technology and creativity and the human mind, but for me, what really stands out is the author's really personal struggle to find connection and meaning, especially, while dealing with mental illness.
Yeah. It's a theme that kind of runs through the whole book, wouldn't you say? Even his fascination with computers, with programming.
Yeah.
It's partly driven by this desire to understand how systems work, how things connect. It's like he's searching for that same kind of order and predictability in his own life.
And yet the book is anything but predictable.
Right.
It's full of these sudden shifts, like
Yeah.
from really technical discussions to these deeply personal reflections to even fictional narratives that seem to come out of nowhere.
Right. And I think those shifts really reflect the experience of living with schizophrenia. There's this feeling of fragmentation, this sense that reality is constantly shifting and rearranging itself.
And he captures that so well, not just through his words, but through the structure of the book itself, It's
Yeah.
like he's inviting us into his mind with all of its complexities and contradictions.
And within that complexity, there's this really profound sense of loneliness. He talks about how difficult it was to maintain friendships, that feeling of being misunderstood, of not being able to bridge that gap between his inner world and the outside world.
Yeah. There's this one passage that really stayed with me. He talks about how, as his symptoms got worse, it was harder to connect with people, even those closest to him.
Yeah.
It's like he was trapped in his own mind, watching the world go on without him.
And that's where I think his vision for Reawood becomes so poignant. It's not just about technological innovation. It's about creating this space where connection is possible, where the limitations of the physical world no longer apply.
It's almost like he's trying to build a bridge between his own isolation and the world that he wants to be a part of. And he's using technology as the material for that bridge.
Exactly. But what's so interesting is that he doesn't present technology as like a simple solution. He knows how technology could actually further isolate us, create these new barriers, even as it breaks down old ones.
Yeah, it's like a paradox.
Right.
We crave connection, but so often we turn to technology in ways that disconnect us from real human interaction.
And I think that's that central tension that Torsved is wrestling with. He's fascinated by technology, but he's also wary of its power. He sees it as a tool that can be used for good or for bad. And ultimately, he believes that it's up to us to decide how we use it.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the silent scream from the meat grinder, what do you think is the most important takeaway for our listeners? What should they take away from this journey that we've been on together?
Well, for me, it's that technology is never neutral. It's shaped by the people who create it, their intentions and the ways that it's used. It's constantly evolving. It pushes us to confront new questions, new ethical dilemmas, and these new possibilities for connection and for isolation.
It's also a reminder that behind every line of code, behind every technological breakthrough, there are human stories. human experiences, human struggles.
They matter. And they remind us that technology isn't just about, bits and bytes. It's about people. It's about how we use these tools to connect, to create, to understand ourselves and the world around us.